Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Um, Hello, uh, my name is Randi Farhan and we are Group 9. This video we would like to present our material about critical race studies. Uh, First, let us introduce ourselves. My name is Randi Farhan and there are Raihan, Raihan Dwi Putra and Rizky Maulana. So for the first topic is the race turn. The race turn appears in social media and cultural theory in the USA. From around the turn of the 19th century, the race turn was instrumental not only in developing a social theory about racism, but also in the rise of literary cultural movements such as Black Arts and the Harlem Renaissance. Here we have Du Bois on the right. Du Bois and social theory. Du, Du Bois' key focus, besides civil rights for blacks in America, was the scientific racism of his age. Eugenics, social Darwinism, and Nazism combined racial prejudice with the scientific theories he demonstrate the inferiority of the black race. His scientific racism was based in biology, a trend critic in race studies and feminist theory as biological determinism. It was also visible in aesthetic theories where black bodies and physiognomies were marked as ugly, grotesque, and even evil. Du Bois disputed that the view the blacks were biologically inferior. He argued that there is no scientific basis for such a belief, and that such a belief was more social than scientific. In this argument, Du Bois was clearly moving toward a social constructionist view of race, where race as a category is not scientifically demonstrable, but in fact emerges within social discourses and practices. Racial differences in biology does not, in this social construction view, validate racial inferiority. Du Bois wrote, what is the real distinction between these nations, Europeans, Chinese, and Americans? Certainly, we must all acknowledge that physical differences play a great part, but no more physical distinction would really define or explain the deeper differences. The cohesiveness and continuity of this group. Du Bois argued that blacks were always central to the USA because they had contributed to its history in various ways. For example, during Reconstruction, blacks were forging alliances and political platforms with whites. Black emancipation often traced to the controversial Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln in 1862 was the key element in this reconstruction. Argued Du Bois, though Du Bois was critical of the Lincoln Proclamation, but despite this, the USA continued to deny civil rights for blacks. One of Du Bois' major insights was the idea of double consciousness. Du Bois argued that the black could never see himself as himself. He saw himself through the eye of the white. That is, the African American perpetually saw himself as the white man saw him. This double consciousness meant that the black man was always two, a black man and an American. Du Bois' major contribution to race cultural study was his active championing of black writers, and artists. As editor of the National Association for Advancement of Colored People (NAACP) periodical crisis, he published the Harlem writers Jean Toomer and Langston Hughes. Du Bois was certain that art is propaganda and the aesthetics could not be divorced from politics. With this shift towards the politics of literary and cultural expression, Du Bois marked a major development in his studies. Hoyt Fuller and Black aesthetics. So in the left is Hoyt Fuller. Alain Locker's The New Negro 1925 was a defining moment in African American social theory. Locke's essay pleaded for a greater amount of self-awareness and consciousness among the blacks. Building on this view, Hoyt Fuller articulated the vision of black arts. 1968. Fuller argued that black aesthetic would be based in a pride in these differences. The black is beautiful ideology is rooted in this argument of Fuller's. Once this artist has accepted the separateness and uniqueness of black culture, it becomes difficult, suggested Fuller, to accept any other writing as universal. Fuller also argued that black works cannot be judged by white standards of literary merit or quality, while mediocre works by white writers are spared. Any work by black writers, argued Fuller, was rigorously examined and attacked as being of low quality. The black writer has to keep writing despite such obviously racist literary ev- evaluation from white critics. Next is Larry Neal, Myth and Racial Memory. Neal retrieved Arkan voodoo, spirit worship, shamanic tradition, and sources of black aesthetic. He turned to figures like the trickster in African mythology as iconic of black consciousness that resist white interpretation of frameworks. Henry Louis Gates Jr. would also return to the trickster. Neal locates the soothsayer, the griot, the sage, as well as the specifically African dance rhythm, styles, and music as the black aesthetic. So here is Neil on the right. What Neil was proposing here was a very political aesthetics. Each of the above was linked to community rather than individual. Every artist, noted Neil, must serve as aspiration of his community and tribe. The use of myth and folklore, which are collective, shared, communitarian, and not individual, is thus essential to the artist. Neil was arguing that there was no need to invent a black tradition, such as tradition already existed as African American cultural heritage. Most significantly, Neil Black's aesthetic argued that art must be ethical. Therefore, black aesthetic and black arts must represent the roots of the victim, blacks, rather than the consciousness or view of their oppressors, even if this meant being attacked by white critics. Uh, let's move on to race and differences. Michael Benton has pointed that race as a concept has been used to speak of differences between population without even concentrating upon what race is a concept. Racial difference has been the cornerstone of violent and brutal campaign against particular race and groups, especially Aboriginal and First Nation people in Canada, Australia, and the USA, and of course the paradigmatic Holocaust. Racial difference has also been marked in terms of economic development, rights and welfare in nation states. It has informed development in law, people, popular culture with its stereotype of black or tribals, and the market. In order to understand the implication of what race means, how it has been defined, Benton Taxonomy 2000, page 61, works effectively for us. First, when race means descent, then it was expected that white considered alliance with blacks as socially dishonorable. When race meant type, whites would have seen sexual union with blacks as producing stock physically inferior to whites and superior to blacks. When race meant subspecies, most members of the public would not have comprehended the working of inheritance and selection. Cornel West traced the genealogy of racism through different historical stages, showing how racial theories blend social, scientific, psychological, and economic discourse. Race has historically been used as a marker of difference, leading to oppression and exploitation, despite the lack of biological evidence for racial superiority. Race remains a central factor in social and political discourse. Critical race studies or CRS analyze race and ethnically in law, history, politics, and culture, emphasizing their role in shaping social structure in the 1990s. White studies emerged, examining whiteness as a site of privilege and power. Scholars like Bell Hooks, Cornel West, and Ruth Frankenberg explored white identity while reactions against multiculturalism and affirmative action led to resurgence of discourse on race and identity. At the same time, the reactions against multiculturalism and affirmative action intensified, particularly in conservative political circles. Some argue that such policies led to reverse racism and undermine meritocracy. This backlash, this backlash contributes to renewed debate over race and identity, with scholars continue to challenge colorblind ideology and advocate for systemic changes. So next will be present by Raihan Dwi Putra.
Okay, thank you, Randi Farhan. I'm gonna explain African American aesthetic and theory. African American literary and cultural theory in the words of Henry Louis Gates, Jr. Hazel Carby, Hortense Spillers, Bell Hooks, and Patricia Hill Collins. Collins' work is discussed under Black Feminism in the chapter on feminism and Stuart Hall, and philosophy in the works of Kwame Anthony Appiah emerged from the Black aesthetic movement and ideas not above, but was also influenced by developments in post-structuralism and cultural studies. For grounding issue of racial and ethnic identity, these theories have first generate new readings of cano- canonical English literary works. To provide frameworks for unraveling race and racism as literary themes. Three, offer models of reading, writing, and critique from within African American myth, folklore, and tradition, and help conceptualize black or ethnic literatures differently. Next, Henry Louis Gates Jr. and signifying. First, repetition and imitation. Repetition and imitation is the unimaginative borrowing of white Europeans' models of criticism, even when the text under examination were black. Next, black aesthetic. Was a separatist move, focusing on the black text as symptomatic, and representative representative of black social condition and politics. Okay, next slide. Next, repetition and difference. Gates this is an innovative use of Euro-American high theory, where the theory is used but also critiqued, especially in the writing of Houston Bucker, Wickel, Ed Hazelcarby, Patricia Hill Collins, and Hortense Pillars. Next synthesis. This is the most developed form of African American criticism, according to Gates, where black tradition met and synthesized with Euro American theory. Next, next slide. Next is signifying. Signifying is his term for the revision and reversal of racist tropes. The Star Baby, Toni Morrison's novel of the same name, or Monkey, used as a pejorative to describe the African race, are appropriated as metaphors and tropes by the African themselves in an act of linguistic and rhetorical agency. Gets right. The ironic reversal of a racist image in the Western imagination of black as simian-like, the signifying monkey, he who dwells at the margin of discourse, ever punning, ever trooping, ever embodying the ambiguities of language, is our troop for repetition and revision. Indeed, our troop of chiasmus itself, repeating and reversing simultaneously as he does in one deaf discourse act. 1987. 236. At this point, it is useful to remember that racism has always invented the languages of differences, of mockery, cruelty and discrimination. Okay, next. Next, these themes in African American literature. First, slavery and memory. Works like Toni Morrison below explore like intergenerational trauma. Next theme is racial pacing and identity. Novels like Nella Larson's Pacing examine the complexities of racial identity. The Black Vernacular. African American literature often incorporates dialects, jazz rhythms, and oral storytelling tradition. Next, First Peoples in Theory. Literary criticism, especially with the post-colonial turn, has begun to pay attention to Aboriginal and First People cultures. While this arguably becomes a native trend, the shift from metropolitan written and Euro-American, which we can quote quite easily as English, to oral vernacular regional literary cultures is timely and politically significant. The indigenous term, as this shift may be termed in context specific, it comes affiliated with social, legal, and political movements seeking Aboriginal rights, land right, welfare, and recognition. Native Americans have been museumized into reservation, effectively genotoized. The first trend of critical thinking about First Peoples is embodied in the work of whites and non-Aboriginals theorizing Aboriginal cultures in what can be termed cross-cultural post-colonial theory. This has resulted in accusation of appropriation and the continued hegemony of urban elite within critical practice. The second strand is the nativist one, where aboriginals and first peoples develop their own critical strategies as a politically committed stance that involves retrieving Native American intellectual tradition, advocated by Craig Womack, 1999, Robert Warder, 1992, and 1997. Among others, this trend resulted in a narrow, exclusive line of thinking. Jeffrey Sisson provides a point of departure into indigenous studies and contributes to a theoretical framework for reading Native American, Australian Aboriginal, tribal, and other native literatures. Sisson defines indigenous culture as cultures that have been transformed through struggles or colonized people to resist and redirect projects of settler nationhood. 2005. First in Jeffrey Sisson, first indigenous cultures are cultures of survival and are defined in terms of their struggles against foreign cultures. Indigenous culture are localized, especially in terms of territory, circumscribed and rooted in very specific histories. Identities in First Peoples writing is a collective and communitarian and therefore rarely highlight a Bildungsroman kind of triumphalist individual narrative.
Okay, the next is mixed race and multi-ethnic culture studies. Mixed race and multi-ethnic culture studies discusses the emergence and significance of mixed race studies in the context of post-structuralism, historical research, migration, and multiculturalism. Here are the key points. The first is origins of mixed race studies. So the study of mixed race identities developed through various intellectual and social movement. There are three key factors influence in this field. The first is post-structuralism and historical research. Post-structuralist thinkers like Michael Foucault and Jacques Derrida argued that identities not fixed but socially constructed. Freud has had already challenged the idea of a unified, stable self, and post-structuralism further dismantled notions of pure racial or cultural identities. Historical research revealed that many cultures had always been interwoven. For example, Dirk Holder's book called Cultures in Contact demonstrated how even the European Renaissance was not purely European but influenced by various global cultures. The second is migration and multiculturalism. After the 1960s, migration from Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean to Western countries, especially the US and UK, dramatically increased. This migration led to multiracial families, neighborhoods, and schools, fundamentally reshaping society. Second and third generation immigrants began to see themselves as having multiple cultural influences, rather than belonging to a single racial or ethnic group. And the last, rise of Black and non-white public intellectuals. Scholars and orators like Toni Morrison, Cornel West, Stuart Hall, Edward Said, Gayatri Spivak, and Homi Bhabha became prominent figures in public discourse. These intellectuals frequently appear in media, universities, and public debates, making race and identity central topics in academic and civic discussions. Their work challenged dominant Western narratives and introduced concepts like hybridity, post-colonialism, and cultural negotiation. The next about mixed race and multi-ethnic cultural studies is challenges to pure identities. Traditionally, many societies have categorized people into rigid racial and ethnic groups, often based on physical features or ancestry. However, modern genetic research has proven that no pure races exist. All human populations have been shaped by migration, intermarriage, and cultural exchange over centuries. Despite the scientific evidence, racial identities continues to hold social and political significance. Like the governments still classify people based on race in censuses. Race-based discrimination persists in many areas, such as job opportunities, education, and legal rights. Many people still identify strongly with a particular racial or ethnic background, even if their ancestry is mixed. The third is shifting perspective on race and identity. So early discussions about mixed race identity were often limited to biracial identities, particularly black or white individuals. By the late 1990s, the conversation expanded to include multiracial identities with more complex ancestries. So Denzi Sena in 1998 introduced the concept of a mulatto nation, arguing that there were now multiple categories of racial mixing, such as Giulietto, Jewish and Black, Gelato, Italian American and African American, Gablinasian, Caucasian, Black, Asian, and Native American, a term popularized by Tiger Woods. So the shift from biracial to multiracial identity shows a growing recognition that race is more fluid and intersectional than previously thought. Next slide. The fourth is race as a persistent social construct. Even though science has disproven race as a biological determinant, racial categories remain socially and politically relevant. So why does race still matter? The first is many legal and social systems still operate on racial classifications. For example, affirmative action policies, hate crime laws, and immigration policies often consider racial and ethnic backgrounds. The second, stereotypes linking race to behavior, intelligence, or morality persist. For instance, Stephen Rupp in 1997 argues that subtle forms of racial bias still influence public perception, even in academic fields that claim to reject racial determinism. The third, multiracial identities challenge traditional racial hierarchies but also reveal how deeply racial categories are embedded in society. Okay, the next topic is about mestiza poetics and theories. The first is mestiza identity and the concept of borderlands. Gloria Anzaldúa, a Chicana feminist writer and theorist, coined the term mestiza consciousness to describe the experience of being culturally and racially mixed. In her book called Borderlands, La Frontera, Anzaldúa describes the US Mexico border as a site of conflict and cultural bending, where it is a place where the first world and the third world meet. It is marked by violence, oppression, and marginalization, but also by creativity and new cultural formation. She argues that the mestiza exists in a liminal space, neither fully belonging to one culture nor the other, constantly negotiating between two worlds. Second, mestiza consciousness and cultural hybridity. The mestiza is a hybrid figure influenced by both European and indigenous ancestry. This identity is fluid and dynamic, challenging rigid facial and national boundaries. The role of the body in mestiza poetics. The mestiza's body is symbolic of racial and cultural mixing. Anzaldúa and other Chicana writers like Cherry Moraga connect mestiza identity to bodily experiences such as sexuality and gender. The mestiza identity is often linked to queer, feminist, and non-binary perspectives, challenging traditional gender roles. Land and the next is land and body. The land is metaphorically linked to the female body, symbolizing both colonization and resistance. The fourth is the language of mestiza poetics. So mestiza writing mixes languages, genres, and forms, reflecting cultural hybridity. Uh, it is written in a mix of English, Spanish, Spanglish, and Nahuatl, breaking the rigid boundaries of language. The fifth, Chicana poetics and the politics of mixing. Alfred Ortega, another Chicano theorist, builds on Anzaldua's ideas, arguing that Chicana poetics is inherently about mixing and hybridity. He introduces the concept of diffracismo, a term from indigenous Mexican literature, which refers to the pairing of opposites to create meaning. Ortega views Chicana literature as a product of interbreeding, much like mestiza identity. It is rooted in a history of colonial violence and forced cultural mixing. And the last is tensions between mestiza identity and cultural nationalism. There are two opposing forces shape Chicana identity. The first is cultural nationalism. Uh, the desire to reclaim and celebrate pre-Hispanic indigenous roots, and hybrid identity, the recognition that mestiza identity is a mixture of multiple influences. Next, next slide, please. Okay, the next topic is being black while being British. This section explores the identities, struggles, and cultural negotiations of black people in Britain. It challenges the idea that British identity is exclusively white and examines how black British culture has developed through migration, colonial history, and racial tensions. The key figure in this discussion is Paul Gilroy, who introduced the concept of Black Atlantic, which highlights how Black identity is shaped by both African and Western influences. The first subtopic in here is the exclusion of Black identity from Britishness. Paul Gilroy's book called criticizes how British identity is often constructed as exclusively white. Historically, Britishness has been defined in opposition to colonized non-white populations. The presence of black people in Britain is often treated as an outsider issue, even though they have been part of British history for centuries. The second, the Black Atlantic hybrid cultural identity. In the Black Atlantic, Gilroy argues that Black identity is not tied to a single nation, but it is instead shaped by a transnational experience. The term Black Atlantic refers to how the African diaspora, slavery, and migration have created a hybrid Black identity that blends elements from different cultures. The key ideas in Black Atlantic is that the Black experience is shaped by both African and Western influences. Black people in Britain do not have to choose between being black and being British. They can be both. And music, literature, and activism play a role in shaping Black British identity. The third is the double consciousness, the struggle of Black British identity. Uh, Gilroy adapts W.E.B. Du Bois' concept of double consciousness, which describes how Black people see themselves both through their own eyes and through the eyes of a racist society. Black Britons often struggle with a dual identity. They are British citizens, but they are often seen as foreigners or outsiders. And they have African or Caribbean heritage, but may not feel fully connected to those cultures. So this creates identity crisis where Black Britons question where they truly belong. The fourth is how Black identity is made visible in British culture. Despite exclusion, Black Britons have made significant contribution to British culture, literature, sports, and politics. Black authors, poets, and musicians use their work to challenge racist stereotypes and redefine what it means to be British. The fifth, racial identity versus national identity, the conflict of being black and British. Many black Britons feel forced to choose between their racial identity and their national identity. British media and politics often reinforce the idea that black people are not fully British. For example, the Windrush scandal in 2018 showed how Black Britons, particularly Caribbean immigrants, were wrongly deported despite having lived in the UK for decades. The sixth is the future of Black British identity, multiculturalism and globalization. Britain is becoming more multicultural, and Black British identity is evolving. Okay, the next is the future of Black British identity, multiculturalism and globalization. Britain is becoming more multicultural, and Black British identity is evolving. The younger generations embrace multiple identities, refusing to be limited by racial or national labels. Social movements like Black Lives Matter UK challenge racism and push for a broader definition of Britishness. Gilroy argues that Britain must recognize its colonial past and diverse present to fully integrate Black identity into its national story. Next, okay, the next is new theories of difference. So this section explores how immigration, race, national identity, and global conflicts have reshaped discussions on difference and belonging in the modern world. After 9/11, issues such as terrorism, immigration policies, and human rights became central concerns for many countries. Theorists like Jacques Derrida, Roberto Esposito, and Ahua Ong have examined how governments and societies define that and treat immigrants, refugees, and ethnic minorities. Their work provides new ways of understanding difference, moving beyond race to consider factors like borders, sovereignty, and legal rights. So the first is about the global context of difference. In recent decades, immigration, globalization, and humanitarian crises have forced countries to rethink who belongs and who does not. Race and ethnicity remain central issues, but they now intersect with concerns about terrorism, for example, Islamophobia after 9/11, immig second, immigration laws, who gets accepted into a country and who does not. The third, human rights, how refugees and displaced people are treated. And the last, national identity, who is considered a true citizen. Uh, while globalization has made the world more connected, many countries have responded by reinforcing borders, increasing surveillance, and restricting migration. Second, Jacques Derrida, hospitality and cosmopolitanism. Derrida explores the idea of hospitality, asking, how do nations decide who to welcome and who to reject? Is hospitality truly unconditional, or is it always tied to laws and power? He argues that true hospitality means welcoming the foreigner without conditions, not asking them to change their identity or prove their worth. However, in reality, governments often set strict conditions for entry, such as the language test for citizenship, economic requirements, for example, for proving financial stability, and racial or cultural biases, like favoring some groups over others. Derrida also introduces the paradox of hospitality. A country must be sovereign to offer hospitality. It must control its borders. But true hospitality means giving up control, welcoming others without restrictions. So this creates a conflict. Can a nation be both sovereign and truly welcoming at the same time? The third, Roberto Esposito, biopolitics, and the politics of life. Esposito explores how governments use race and biology to control populations. He builds on Michael Foucault's concept of biopolitics, which examines how states regulate human life. Governments create categories of people who are seen as threat or undesirable, often based on race, ethnicity, and nationality. Esposito introduces the idea of immunity versus community, where community people share common rights and responsibilities. Uh, in immunity, some individuals are excluded from this community to protect the majority. For example, some countries deny healthcare, citizenship, or legal protections to immigrants, treating them as outsiders who do not deserve the same rights as native-born citizens. The four Ahwaong, the refugee and state power. Ong examines how refugees and immigrants are treated differently based on race, class, and political usefulness. She argues that Western countries are welcome some immigrants, like, for example, skilled workers and wealthy investors, and they also reject others, such as poor refugees, political exiles, people from unwanted racial backgrounds. She identifies three technologies of subject making that subject that shape immigration policies. The first is racial hierarchies, second, moral judgments, and the third, the politics of refugee status. And the fifth, the future of difference, race, borders, and identity. Governments continue to define difference based on race, class, and nationality. Even as we move beyond biological racism, social and political racism still exists. New forms of border control, surveillance, and discrimination create modern divisions between insiders and outsiders. The works of Derrida, Exposito, and Ong highlight the contradiction in how countries talk about inclusion, diversity, and human rights, while simultaneously reinforcing borders and exclusions. The next topic is about Jacques Derrida, hospitality and cosmopolitanism. This section explores Jacques Derrida's idea on hospitality, cosmopolitanism, and the treatment of foreigners. Derrida challenges the idea that nations can overthrow conditional hospitality, arguing that hospitality is always controlled by laws, power, and national identity. He examines how borders, immigration policies, and national sovereignty shape who is welcome and who is excluded. His work is especially relevant in debates about refugees, asylum seekers, and multiculturalism. The first uh, is about the paradox of hospitality. Derrida introduces a major contradiction in hospitality. True hospitality means welcoming strangers without conditions. However, governments impose strict rules on who can enter, stay, or become a citizen. So this means hospitality is never fully open. It's always regulated by power and legal systems. The second, conditional versus unconditional hospitality. Uh, so Derrida distinguishes between two types of hospitality. The first is unconditional hospitality. It's the purest form of hospitality, like welcoming strangers without asking for identification, background, or purpose. If this is an ethical ideal, but it is rarely practiced in reality. If a country practices unconditional hospitality, it will have open borders and no immigration restrictions. And the second is conditional hospitality, the real world version of hospitality, where nations control who enters. The condition include proving legal status, speaking the national language, and contributing economically. This is the hospitality that governments enforce, often favoring some groups over others. The third is the role of language in hospitality. Derrida argues that language is a tool of power in deciding who is welcome. Many countries requires immigrants to speak the national language before granting citizenship. This creates barrier, making it harder for non-native speakers to integrate. The requirement to speak our language is a way of controlling who can belong. The fourth, hospitality and borders. Who is the host and who is the guest? Derrida explores how borders create divisions between host and guest. The host or the nation decides who can enter and under what conditions. The guest or the immigrant or refugee must follow the host rules and may not always feel truly accepted. Sometimes the power dynamic is reversed. Colonized nations were historically forced to welcome European settlers. Today, former colonial powers like the UK and France struggle to welcome immigrants from their former colonies. Next, fifth, cities of refuge. Can there be uh, a truly open space? Derrida proposes the idea of cities of refuge, places that will welcome refugees without national restrictions. Uh, the study, these, these, these cities would offer safe spaces beyond government control, focus on human rights rather than nationality. However, Derrida acknowledges that even these spaces will still need rules and governance, making true hospitality difficult. The sixth, the political reality of hospitality, fear and security. Many countries use fear aus- of outsiders to justify stricter immigration laws. After 9/11, many Western nations increased border security, restricted asylum applications, and monitor Muslim immigrants more closely. This shows how hospitality is often sacrificed for national security concerns. The seven, the future of hospitality. Can nations be more open? Derrida challenges nations to rethink hospitality beyond borders. He asks, can we create a world where people are welcome as human first before nationality? However, he also acknowledges the sovereignty and security concerns make this difficult. Next topic is about Roberto Esposito and biopolitics. This section explores Roberto Esposito's concept of biopolitics, which examines how governments use biology, race, and identity to control populations. Esposito builds on Michael Foucault's idea of biopower, showing how states regulate people's lives through health policies, surveillance, and immigration laws. One of Esposito's key arguments is that modern politics is shaped by conflict between community and immunity. Governments create exclusive communities by treating some groups as threats that need to be controlled or excluded. Uh, okay, the first is what is biopolitics? Biopolitics refers to how governments control life itself, who gets to live, who gets resources, and who is excluded. Uh, the second, the conflict between community and immunity. This is key concepts Esposito introduce in his theory of biopolitics. There is community, a society of where people share rights and responsibilities. And there's immunity. It is the protection of the community, excluding certain groups. The third, biopolitics and the control of immigration. Esposito's theory applies to immigration policies, where government use biological and racial differences to decide who is allowed to enter. The fourth, the historical roots of biopolitics, Nazi Germany and eugenics. The example for this subtopic is in China. China's surveillance of Uyghur Muslims. So the Chinese government tracks their DNA, restricts births, and places them in re-education camps, using biopolitical control to suppress an ethnic minority. The fifth, biometric surveillance, the new phase of biopolitics. In the modern world, biopolitics has evolved into biometric surveillance. Government use facial recognitions, fingerprinting, and digital tracking to monitor citizens and immigrants. These technologies create new forms of exclusions, reinforcing ideas who belongs and who is a threat. The sixth, Esposito's solution, affirmative biopolitics. Esposito argues that we need a new kind of biopolitics, the one that values all human life equally. So instead of using immunity to exclude people, society should focus on building true communities that do not rely on exclusion. And the last subtopic is the future of biopolitics, inclusion versus exclusion. As technology and globalization expand, government must decide how they treat people from different backgrounds. Will they use biopolitics to exclude and control, or to create more inclusive societies? Esposito challenges us to rethink who is included in our communities and how we define human value. The next topic is about Ahwaong and the refugee. This This section explores Ahwaong's analysis of refugees, immigrations, and state of control. Ong examines how government categorize and treat refugees differently based on race, class, and political convenience. Uh, okay, the first is the politics of refugee status, who is accepted and who is rejected. Not all refugees are treated equally. Governments decide who deserves help based on political and racial factors. Some groups are welcomed because they fit a country's political interests, while others are rejected. Second, the race and class in refugee acceptance. For the example for this is the UK and Canada. They have skilled worker visas that prioritize wealthy, educated immigrants. The third is technologies of subject making, how governments shape refugee identities. Ong introduces the idea of technologies of subject making, the different ways governments control and shape refugees' lives. The refugee and the state, a struggle for belonging. The example for this is the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh have lived in camps for decades with no path to citizenship. And another example is Palestinian refugees in Lebanon face restrictions and on employment and travel, despite living there for generations. The fifth is globalization and the refugee crisis. The example for this is the US and Europe contributed to conflicts in the Middle East but then refused to accept many refugees from the region. Rich countries contribute the most to climate change, but poorer countries suffer the worst consequences, forcing many people to migrate. And the last is the future of refugees, inclusion or continued exclusion. Will the world move toward more inclusive refugee policies, or will countries continue to close their borders and restrict asylum? So Ong argues that nations must recognize their role in causing refugee crisis and take responsibility. Refugees should not just be seen as victims, they should be treated as equal participants in society. Okay, so I think that's all we can explain about our topic. Thank you for watching. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
All right. Thank you, Rizky, for the presentation. So, last thing we want to discuss about our uh belum di belum lanjut. Kajian apa bahasa Inggris?
Pakai bahasa Indonesia aja.
All right. Thank you, Rizky, for the presentation. So next we will discuss about kajian kami mengenai topik ini, critical race studies. Jadi media apa yang akan kami gunakan? Jadi kami memilih media film yang filmnya berjudul Get Out. Film ini sangat bersambung ya dengan topik yang kami bahas mengenai race, critical race, di mana film ini membahas bagaimana orang kulit hitam didiskriminasi. Jadi untuk kedepannya kami akan mengkaji film ini dan ya seperti itu. Thank you so much. We apologize if there is any mistake. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.